Welcome to SoundBit, the podcast where we discuss music and video games, and sometimes both. I'm your host, Annie Abu Hamid, and I'm joined by my brothers Thani and Theo.
I'm Thani.
I'm Theo.
All right, great.
So you can recognize my voice when I speak.
Thanks for joining me, guys.
Yeah, we're glad to be here.
Today we'll be talking about the role of music in video games. So I thought we'd start by tackling this small question. How important is accompanying music and diegetic sound in the context of gameplay? Before we go any further, I will clarify diegetic sound is very similar to Foley sound, which is basically, it's just the sound that you can see on screen. So if I'm writing in a notepad and you can hear a little scribbling, that's diegetic sound.
Well, Theo, you go first.
Yeah, I'll answer this. So for me, I think the accompanying music and the diegetic sound, they should be working together. First of all, I mean, if they're clashing, it's going to take away from the gameplay because you're focused on how they're not in sync with each other. I think whenever like the beat of the accompanying music works with the diegetic sound, it definitely, for me, like when I'm playing, it gives me a rhythm and it helps me get focused and it really engages me in the game and it gets me, like, immerses me in there.
Yeah.
Well, they both need to be present traditionally. Personally, I think that being able to combine the two to where that they interweave naturally within one another would be very cool. I've seen it happen before in artistic games or even just arcade games where the Foley sound, the diegetic sound happens in line rhythmically and tonally within the background music. Now that, like I said, that may present itself better in a more artistic presentation. When it comes to just normal traditional game making for the masses, I would say, personally, whenever I play games, I turn the background music down. I think that's more just a personal preference. I'm a fan of sound more than I am of music. Maybe that's just because the music that video games tend to have is just boring to me. But yeah, I think that they're both necessary. Like I said before, I think it would be very cool to see more and more of them being more blended together, being able to work with each other more than kind of being separate mediums.
Yeah, those are great answers. I agree. I think music and diegetic sound are both really important. I'm actually more of a fan of music, depending on the game that I'm playing. But another question kind of coming from that is how common is it, or do games that don't need music exist? And like, have you seen games that you really enjoyed that don't use music, or like that you find they were extremely effective in the way that they kind of took that mechanic of not using like traditional music and just kind of like almost like a John Cage kind of take on it, where like the sound is the music?
You can go ahead, Danny.
I have played games like that. They typically present themselves more of an indie format, kind of market themselves more as an indie game. I'm pretty sure games like Limbo don't have scores. Again, yeah, you're right. It is more kind of a John Cage philosophy that the sound kind of is the music and becomes the music. And in fact, I actually watched a recent interview with the sound designers and composers from the new Blade Runner film.
Oh, yeah.
And they kind of followed that same philosophy. The director, Denis, wanted the sound to become more of a musical presence and the music to kind of take a backseat. In fact, actually, the composer behind the Avatar: The Last Airbender and what was the name of the other one?
Korra?
Legend of Korra. Thank you. TV show scores. He has a philosophy that I much agree with, which is kind of going against the whole wall of sound scores that a lot of blockbuster films and video games tend to have, where every moment of the game is saturated with some amount of score. To me, that just seems like overkill. I think that I get annoyed. In fact, that's one of the reasons why I turn down the music, because it's always happening.
Yeah.
And it becomes less important that way.
It's like sensory overload a little bit.
Yeah, it's unnecessary, and they do it because I think most producers and video game developers kind of follow that trend just because, I think as gamers we do enjoy kind of that blast of senses with the music and the sound and the story and the characters and the art, all coming together. But I think what they do is they take that moment and they make the whole game that way.
Yeah.
Which is, I mean, that literally just, it makes the whole thing pointless. It reminds me of Incredibles, whenever the main villain was saying that, you know, when everybody's a superhero, no one's a superhero. When the whole game has music, there's no music. I mean, there is music technically, but it's not, it doesn't fulfill its duty as music, I think, should be. So I am always, as a music maker myself, I'm always, I do my best to kind of push a little bit for making soundtracks that have less content, and so that the gameplay actually has a lot more silence. I think silence is a powerful thing. I think a lot of games don't have that anymore.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I've played a couple games here and there that have, at the very least, holes in the soundtrack where there isn't music playing during my gameplay, and I think it definitely has an effect. I definitely find myself muting the soundtrack, muting the music in a video game a lot, just because, like, if I've played the game a lot and the music is always playing, it gets annoying and drives me insane when I'm trying to focus on the game. And then, you know, I don't like the music anymore because I've heard it so many times. So I think it'll definitely, you know, having less music, at least less music, would definitely enhance gameplay more. And it would also let people savor the music when it's going, rather than just listening to it over and over, and kind of it's kind of makes you feel spoiled in a way, because it should be a treat, the music, you know.
Yeah, and it's the whole time.
Yeah.
Yeah, it just makes you fat.
Yeah, I think those are really, really valid. I think I was kind of going off of what you said earlier, where if the whole soundtrack or the whole experience is filled with music, then there is really no music, because the music becomes the silence. I was also gonna say, as a music maker, I find that like my favorite songs to make are the ones that are like very simple and very like quiet, because I think there's so much intensity in those moments, and I think a lot of game developers take the kind of like the sensation of like hearing a ton of different instruments and like a very like complicated and very like grandiose, thank you, of just like this, like kind of they take that mindset of like, let's make it as big as possible because then it's epic. But then in that way it like really takes away from whatever you're doing, and like in the other moments it's just it like, if the whole thing can't be epic, because then none of it is epic, and then it just like you kind of just get tired. I think I always get tired of games that try to make everything, like every moment, epic, because it's not. And then they take away, again, like those quiet moments, even like the moments of just like pure silence. Those can be so powerful, but I think a lot of game developers forget that those are really powerful moments, and so they just focus on that. Like that's a problem that I find also with like AAA games, is they find, or not just AAA, there's like indie games I'm sure that do this as well, but they really try to capitalize on the trends and what they see or what they think gamers really, really like, or like, so they try to cash in on that, and then they forget kind of like about the kind of like the game as like, not every game has to be an art piece, but in a way you're trying, the whole point of a game, I think for a lot of them, is to like tell a story, and I feel like, again, like trying to make the whole thing like epic and huge, like really takes away from like the storytelling elements for me.
Yeah, I think we're starting to see a pushback in some of the indie games, modern recent indie games, like you've mentioned Journey before multiple times, and particularly I'm a big fan of the score from Hyper Light Drifter by Disaster Piece. And really, I think, we're seeing, like we've mentioned before, that game developers are taking that epic feeling and kind of stretching it to fill the entirety of the gameplay. And what used to be considered epic is now normal.
Yeah.
And we're seeing kind of, I don't know, if you just look at a teaser from Journey or Hyper Light Drifter, the music that they're playing, which is much more softer, subtler, with much smaller instrumentations and ensembles, being much more understated, is now the new epic, because it's totally different. And it creates a mood of just kind of the silence requires you to hear your own thoughts. I think
Yeah.
if you're not being blasted from all perspectives with some loud epic cue. The silence kind of brings more things to the forefront, and in that way things become epic again.
Right. Actually, one thing that, again, sorry, just going off of Journey and going off of the kind of the silence thing, is that the actually Austin Wintory, the guy who composed the whole of Journey, the whole Journey soundtrack, we had the opportunity to hear him in our AET class, and he came and talked to us. It was really cool. And he talked a lot about, one of the biggest things that stood out to me was when he was saying how we were just looking for a way to kind of like make this moment in the game like super epic, and we just kept making it bigger and bigger. But then he said he was like, it's not working, and so then he went to, I think, another concert, and then he just went back. He went back to like a cello solo, and he realized that like what made it more epic was actually making it much smaller, like
Taking away stuff.
Yeah, taking it all the way back to kind of the beginning, and it kind of became a full circle. And he said that was really the moment of kind of like the moment where it settled for him, and I was like, that was like really cool to hear, because I always felt like I do really love like complicated music. Like I don't like, I think big music is fun, but I think always like the ones that are like more meaningful to me are the ones that are like quiet and stripped away and like very vulnerable. I think that's very special. Yeah. So do you want to say something, Theo?
Less is more.
Well, yeah, along that thought, I think that, I mean, this is my philosophy with everything, but there's always a balance. You have to be striking a balance. And the balance doesn't ever have to be 50-50. It rarely is. But, the balance, the dichotomy between how much loud music and how much softer, subtler music you have, it has to be present, You have to have both, I think, if you want to reach that level of impact that I think game developers tend to want to reach.
Yeah, exactly. Going to, I think my last question for today. So, having all of that said, I'm really interested in knowing what you guys' favorite soundtrack is, like for video games. Like what is one that you just like, you always go back to, or one that you're just like, you hear it and you're like, oh yes, that video game. Like I loved that soundtrack. I know, Theo, you typically talk about Destiny. I don't know if that's the answer that you're going to give, but I have a feeling that that's...
Yeah, Destiny is my favorite soundtrack of all video games. I mean, I think maybe not the best, but up there definitely, along with Halo soundtracks. And I think Ori and the Blind Forest has a really nice soundtrack. And one of the things that I really like about the Destiny soundtrack is when you're in the tower, which is basically like the social hub where you gather yourself and you collect your items and equip yourself for the next battle, for the next mission, for the next adventure. In there is where you have all this this really calming music. Like, just sometimes it's just like a women's choir in the background, and then like a harp and a flute kind of doing a duet thing, and or stuff like that. It's really peaceful, and it really helps you like collect your thoughts, and just it's really serene. And then like in space, when you're in orbit around a planet ready to go into the next adventure, there's always this dissonant choir sound effect. There's men and women singing. Usually the men are like, holding some sort of bass line, and then the women are up on the top, and they're doing some discordic, harmonies and melodies that really give this eerie, uneasy effect, but it gets you excited for the next mission. And there's also a lot of like sound effects. There's like a lot of what is it?
Diegetic?
Kind of diegetic, except you can't see it. It's just like normal sound effects that you would see, like, well, I can't name them now, but there's usually like some really like, and when you're in combat, like there's a lot of strings, like intense strings with percussion, which I'm talking about. There's like this epic sound, and like the great thing is that the epic sound, like, it dies out as soon as you're out of combat. Like, as soon as you finish that battle in the mission, it sort of dies down and it gives you time to collect your thoughts and, continue moving. So I just really like there's a lot of variation and a lot of cool serenity and stuff like that.
Nice. What about you, Thani?
I think for me, I'll have to name two. The first one that I'd name would be the soundtrack from Final Fantasy 13.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Um, all of the Final Fantasy, all of the soundtracks throughout all the games that Nobuo Uematsu did were fantastic. But the one composed by Masashi in the 13th volume, I think was specifically enjoyable to me because there was a lot more live instrument influence, which I think was newer to video games at that time. And again, I mean, just the Japanese school of thought when it comes to composing music is very refreshing when growing up in the Western world. Again, I mean, I feel like I've always been inspired by a lot of the sounds that he ended up creating. There's a lot of kind of bell-like sonorities through the electronic and acoustic recording that they did for that album. But more recently, I've mentioned Disaster Piece's work on Hyper Light Drifter soundtrack, which to me, as a music producer in general, I've always, really loved the chiptune 8-bit sound. But what he does with that is he takes those sounds, but then he dresses them up in just reverb and other kinds of ring modulation and other effects to make them much more soft without destroying the original 8-bit sound. Yeah. It's still 8-bit, and you can recognize it as those original 90s chiptune cards, but it's drenched and flooded in just a chain of wet effects that totally create a different atmosphere. And again, it's softer. None of the tracks on the soundtrack are particularly driving or complex. They do get loud and they do get soft, which is nice. But again, it's much more understated. I think it's a pushback against kind of the more blockbuster video games out there. So Disaster Piece's work on Hyper Light Drifter, I think specifically, is a soundtrack that has my ear right now a lot.
That's good. Yeah, I think that I'd my favorite is still probably Legend of Zelda: Wind Waker for me. I think I have a little bit of bias because it was one of my childhood games, so there's that kind of I grew up with it, and so it has a special place in my heart. But there's something about it. Everything about it is very even the more somber parts of the game. It's very light and airy, and it's very something about it is so refreshing. I know everyone always talks about Dragon's Roost Island. People always talk about, oh yeah, even after I was completely done with this island, I still go back. I still ride the boat all the way back because it's just such a fun upbeat soundtrack, and it's very again, they're not really they're all upbeat and they're all light, but none of them are very convoluted. They're not extremely layered. I mean, they have layers, but it's all very, I think it's just very simple, and I think it's one of the games that continues to be one of my favorites, even in the gameplay. I think it was just the fact that it was a simpler take on games in general. But yeah, I think it's just beautiful.
Going back to Theo real quick.
Yeah.
You've played Destiny, and now you've played Destiny 2. How did the soundtracks compare?
Oh, that's a good question.
Well, I honestly...
Are they worked on by the same composer? I don't know.
I would have to assume so, because they sound similar. Just in the kind of effects they use and the kind of the music that they play. It even takes on a same kind of key and pattern as some of the other pieces in Destiny 1 in the original game. There's definitely some different things that are going on, but I would have to say, I mean, I haven't spent as much time on Destiny 2 as I have on Destiny 1, so to compare the music, Destiny 1 is still in my head more than Destiny 2, so it's hard to compare them, but I definitely say they're similar. I mean,
I think sequels are always harder to, and that's probably actually a testament to all of Final Fantasy. The fact that people continue to play and they love the soundtracks is they keep I think that just means that they're doing really well. Like whatever they're doing, it's working to like change it up for each game. Because I think it's harder when like even sometimes the Mario soundtracks for me. I mean, like some of them I really really love, and then some of them are just kind of they're like old after a while because it's the same franchise over and over and over again. And it's not that I don't enjoy it or like I'm not excited for the new installments, but I feel like sometimes they do need to kind of like freshen up their sound a little bit, try something new.
Well, in defense of Mario, though, Final Fantasy, every episode is
About
completely fresh with
Yeah.
new characters, new environment, new story.
That's true.
And so everything about the only thing really connecting the Final Fantasy games together is the team of behind Square Enix.
Yeah.
I mean, but everything about them is really quite different.
That's true. Yeah. Well, that was an awesome discussion, guys. I really appreciate your thoughts.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
That's it for this cast. Hear you next time.